What lies beneath the floorboards of America's oldest schools will make you question everything you thought you knew about education. When renovation crews tear down walls and maintenance workers explore forgotten basement corners, they're not just uncovering dust and cobwebs, they're finding evidence of secrets that were meant to stay buried forever. From preserved medical specimens that reveal illegal experiments on students to recording equipment still playing voices from decades past, these discoveries prove that some educational institutions harbored darkness far beyond failing grades. Tonight, we're taking you into 7 true stories that will make you grateful you never had to stay after school in these buildings. Each discovery was documented, investigated, and verified. But what makes these findings truly terrifying is how many similar basements across the country remain unexplored. The contractors who made these discoveries didn't just find old textbooks and broken desks. They uncovered evidence of cover-ups, conspiracies, and crimes that parents trusted these schools to protect their children from. Before we dive into these bone-chilling accounts, make sure to click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because once you hear what was hidden beneath these schools, you'll want to stay updated on every disturbing truth we uncover. These aren't urban legends or ghost stories. These are documented discoveries that prove the most horrifying monsters aren't supernatural. They're human. Story 1. Marcus Chen had been renovating old buildings for 15 years, transforming forgotten structures into modern spaces, but nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what he would uncover beneath Lincoln Elementary School in the remote hills of Pennsylvania. The contract seemed straightforward enough when the school board approached his construction company in early March. Convert the abandoned 1940s elementary school into affordable senior housing for the growing elderly population in their rural community. Marcus had handled similar projects before, and the initial walkthrough revealed nothing more concerning than typical decay from decades of neglect: peeling paint, broken windows, and the musty smell of time that clung to every corner of the 3-story brick building. His crew began work on a crisp Monday morning, starting with the basement where they planned to install new electrical systems and plumbing that would serve the future residents. The basement appeared unremarkable at first glance: concrete floors, exposed beams, and the standard maze of pipes and electrical conduits that characterized buildings from that era. However, it was Marcus's youngest crew member, Jake Morrison, who first noticed something odd about the eastern wall while measuring for new electrical outlets. The wall seemed thicker than it should be, and when Jake tapped it with his hammer, the sound was hollow rather than the solid thunk they expected from concrete. Marcus initially dismissed it as probably just an old storage closet that had been walled over during previous renovations, but his curiosity got the better of him when they discovered that the wall didn't match any of the architectural plans provided by the school district. After 3 days of methodical investigation, measuring the exterior dimensions against the interior layout, Marcus realized there was definitely a hidden space approximately 12 feet wide and 20 feet long behind what appeared to be a false wall constructed sometime in the late 1960s based on the style of concrete and rebar they could see. When Marcus brought his concerns to the school board, they seemed unusually nervous about his discovery and quickly authorized him to break through the wall, claiming they just wanted to ensure there were no structural issues that could affect the renovation project. The moment Marcus's sledgehammer broke through the concrete barrier, a rush of stale, chemical-tinged air escaped that made his entire crew step back and cover their faces with their shirts. Behind the wall was a perfectly preserved room that looked like it had been sealed in time, containing metal filing cabinets, laboratory equipment, and what appeared to be a small medical examination area complete with a vintage doctor's table and overhead lighting. The discovery sent chills down Marcus's spine because everything in the room was meticulously organized and clean, as if someone had prepared it for long-term storage before sealing it away from the world. The filing cabinets contained thousands of documents that revealed the horrifying truth about Lincoln Elementary's darkest period between 1952 and 1962-1967, when the school had served as a testing ground for government-sponsored psychological and medical experiments on children. Marcus spent hours reading through files that detailed how school administrators, working in collaboration with researchers from a nearby university and federal agencies, had secretly administered experimental drugs to students under the guise of mandatory vitamin supplements and routine health checkups. The documentation was thorough and chilling, including detailed medical records, psychological evaluations, behavioral assessments, and progress reports that tracked how various experimental substances affected the children's personalities, learning abilities, and social interactions. What made Marcus physically sick was discovering that the experiments weren't random. They had specifically targeted children from low-income families, minorities, and students whose parents were considered undesirable by the community's social elite. The files contained before and after photographs of students that showed dramatic physical and emotional changes, along with handwritten notes from researchers describing the children's reactions to different drug combinations with the clinical detachment of scientists studying laboratory animals. As Marcus continued reading, he found records indicating that the experiments had included everything from early versions of psychiatric medications and behavior modification drugs to substances designed to enhance learning capacity and others intended to suppress aggressive tendencies in students deemed problematic by their teachers. The most disturbing revelation came when Marcus discovered his own father's name listed as Subject 127 in the experimental records, James Chen, who had attended Lincoln Elementary as a 7-year-old boy in 1961 and had been administered experimental tranquilizers and memory-affecting drugs that explained his lifelong struggles with severe anxiety, memory loss, and unexplained tremors that had plagued him until his death 5 years earlier. The files revealed that James had been selected for the program because his family had recently immigrated from China and were considered ideal test subjects due to their limited English skills and unfamiliarity with American educational systems, making them unlikely to question unusual medical procedures or report concerns to authorities. Marcus realized with growing horror that his father's mental health issues, his struggles with depression and paranoia, and his early death at age 63 were all likely consequences of the experiments he had endured as a child, and the family had never known the real reason behind his suffering. The final documents in the collection included a government memo dated October 1967, ordering the immediate termination of Project Classroom and the complete destruction of all evidence related to the experimental program, but clearly someone at Lincoln Elementary had disobeyed those orders and preserved the documentation in the hidden room. Marcus discovered that the cover-up extended far beyond the school itself when he researched the fates of other children who had been part of the experiments, and learned that over 40 former Lincoln Elementary students had died by suicide or drug overdose before reaching age 30, while many others had spent their adult lives cycling in and out of psychiatric facilities, never knowing they were victims of unauthorized human experimentation that had permanently damaged their brain chemistry and psychological development. Story 2. Sarah Delmont had built her reputation as one of the most reliable electricians in the Pacific Northwest over 12 years of meticulous work, specializing in rewiring historic buildings and bringing century-old electrical systems up to modern safety standards, but the contract at Riverside High School in the remote logging town of Cedar Falls, Oregon, would challenge everything she thought she understood about her profession and reality itself. The school district had hired her company in late September to upgrade the electrical infrastructure throughout the massive brick building that had served the community since 1923, before its closure in 1989 when declining enrollment and budget cuts forced consolidation with neighboring districts. Sarah's initial assessment revealed typical issues for a building of that age: outdated wiring, overloaded circuits, and junction boxes that hadn't been touched since the Eisenhower administration. But what puzzled her from the first day was discovering that several electrical meters throughout the basement were showing active power consumption, despite the building being supposedly disconnected from the grid for over 30 years. Her investigation led her through a maze of corridors and storage rooms in the school's sprawling basement, following power lines that seemed to lead nowhere until she noticed a steady humming sound coming from behind a heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," that was secured with a padlock so corroded it looked like it hadn't been opened since the Carter presidency. Sarah's curiosity turned to unease when she realized the electrical draw was significant enough to power multiple rooms, and the steady rhythm of the humming suggested machinery that was not only operational, but actively working on some kind of regular cycle. After obtaining permission from the district maintenance supervisor, Sarah cut through the rusted padlock with bolt cutters and pushed open the heavy door to reveal a room that defied everything she knew about the school's history and purpose. The space contained an elaborate array of vintage recording equipment from the 1970s that was not only still functional, but actively recording onto reel-to-reel tapes with multiple machines running simultaneously and dozens of microphones feeding into a central mixing board that looked like it belonged in a professional recording studio rather than a small-town high school basement. The equipment was meticulously maintained despite the building's abandonment, with no dust on the controls and indicator lights showing that various recording channels were actively monitoring different areas throughout the building. Sarah discovered that the microphone system had been wired throughout the entire school with incredible sophistication, including hidden recording devices in classrooms, offices, bathrooms, and even the gymnasium, creating a comprehensive surveillance network that could capture every conversation and sound within the building's walls. The hundreds of labeled tapes stacked on industrial shelving units dated back to 1971 and contained audio recordings that made Sarah's blood run cold as she listened through crackling headphones that were plugged into the monitoring station. The earliest tapes captured normal school activities like classroom discussions and administrative meetings, but as Sarah progressed through the chronological collection, the content became increasingly disturbing with recordings of private conversations between teachers discussing which students to target for special attention, administrative planning sessions where they strategized about isolating certain children from their families, and most horrifying of all, audio of students crying, pleading, and screaming during what sounded like punishment sessions taking place in rooms that didn't appear on any school blueprint she had seen. One particularly chilling tape from March 1983 contained the voice of Principal Harold Vance explaining to an unidentified colleague how they were using the recording system not just for surveillance, but for gathering blackmail material on teachers, parents, and community members to ensure their silence and cooperation with whatever agenda the school administration was pursuing behind closed doors. Sarah realized with growing horror that the system had been designed to automatically begin recording whenever motion sensors detected someone entering specific areas of the building, and as she examined the equipment more closely, she discovered that several machines were recording onto fresh tapes that shouldn't have existed after 30 years of abandonment. The most terrifying revelation came when Sarah noticed that one of the recording machines was labeled with yesterday's date and contained audio of her own voice from when she had first entered the building that morning. But mixed with her recorded conversations were the voices of people who supposedly no longer worked at the school, including Principal Vance giving detailed instructions about monitoring her activities, despite the fact that district records showed he had died in a suspicious car accident in 1990. As Sarah tried to process this impossible situation, she heard her own voice playing through the room's speaker system, but the audio was distorted and manipulated to make it sound like she was having conversations with people who weren't there, discussing plans to cover up her discoveries and agreeing to keep the recording system operational for future use. When Sarah attempted to leave the building with evidence of what she had found, she discovered that all the exits had been electronically locked and could only be controlled from the basement recording room, where a new tape had begun playing on a continuous loop featuring her own voice, mechanically altered and repeated over and over, announcing that Sarah Delmont never left Riverside High School, Sarah Delmont is still here, Sarah Delmont belongs to the system now. The psychological torment continued for 3 days as Sarah remained trapped in the building with the recording equipment documenting her every word, scream, and breakdown, while the speakers throughout the school played back-manipulated versions of her voice having conversations with the ghosts of administrators and teachers who had supposedly died decades earlier. When her crew finally found her unconscious in the basement after she failed to return home, Sarah was surrounded by hundreds of new tapes bearing her name and containing 18 continuous hours of her own voice speaking in languages she didn't recognize, describing rooms and events that had never been part of Riverside High School's documented history. But when investigators examined the recording equipment, they found that every tape Sarah claimed to have heard was completely blank, except for one that contained only the sound of electrical humming and her own terrified breathing. Story 3. Elena Vasquez had dreamed of becoming an art teacher since her own middle school years when a passionate instructor had helped her discover her talent for painting. And when she was offered the position at Millbrook Middle School in the picturesque mountains of Vermont, she felt like her career was finally falling into place after years of substitute teaching and part-time positions at various schools throughout New England. The school seemed perfect for nurturing young artistic minds, with large windows that filled the classrooms with natural light, well-equipped art studios, and a supportive administration that emphasized creative education as a core part of their curriculum. Elena's excitement reached new heights when the principal, Dr. Margaret Harrison, showed her the extensive art supplies and storage areas in the basement, explaining that the school had a 40-year tradition of preserving student artwork as part of their permanent collection and encouraging Elena to explore the archives to get inspiration for her lesson plans. The basement art storage room was vast and meticulously organized, with thousands of pieces arranged chronologically in filing systems that dated back to the school's founding in 1965, and Elena initially felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of creative work produced by generations of students who had passed through Millbrook's halls. As Elena began sorting through the collection during her first week, she was impressed by the quality and creativity of the artwork, but gradually began noticing something deeply unsettling about many of the pieces that made her question whether she was losing her mind or stumbling upon something far more sinister than a simple art archive. The pattern emerged slowly as Elena examined hundreds of paintings, drawings, and sculptures created by children between ages 11 and 14. But what made her hands tremble and her stomach churn was the realization that every single piece depicted events, disasters, and tragedies that had occurred months or sometimes years after the artwork was supposedly created. Her first discovery was a detailed watercolor painting dated March 15, 1985, created by 12-year-old Timothy Walsh, showing the Space Shuttle Challenger exploding in mid-flight with shocking accuracy that included specific details about the weather conditions, the exact moment of the explosion, and even the expressions of horror on the faces of spectators that wouldn't be captured by television cameras until January 28, 1986, nearly a year later. Elena initially tried to rationalize this as coincidence or perhaps mislabeled dates, but as she continued exploring the collection, she found dozens of similar examples that defied logical explanation and suggested something far more disturbing than simple clerical errors. The collection included a series of charcoal drawings from October 1999 showing the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center collapsing, created by various seventh-grade students who had never been to New York City, with one drawing specifically labeled September 11, 2001, in a child's handwriting and showing people jumping from windows in positions that exactly matched photographs that wouldn't be taken for another 2 years. Elena discovered clay sculptures from 2002 depicting the devastating tsunami that would hit Southeast Asia in December 2004, created by a 13-year-old girl named Patricia Hoffman, with miniature figures and buildings that perfectly replicated scenes from news footage that didn't exist when the sculpture was made. The artwork wasn't limited to major disasters, but included local tragedies as well, such as a 1978 oil painting showing a specific car accident that wouldn't occur until 1982, complete with accurate license plate numbers and the exact location where a family of 4 would lose their lives on a snowy December evening. The most chilling aspect of Elena's discovery wasn't just the prophetic nature of the artwork, but the realization that every single piece had been created by students enrolled in advanced art classes taught by the same instructor, Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, who had worked at Millbrook Middle School from 1978 until her mysterious disappearance in early 2018, just months before Elena was hired to replace her. Elena found Mrs. Morrison's personal teaching notes hidden behind a stack of canvases, and the contents revealed a systematic program of what the teacher called creative visualization experiments that involved specific meditation techniques, guided imagery sessions, and art materials that had been specially prepared with trace amounts of chemicals that Mrs. Morrison had been secretly adding to paints, clay, and drawing supplies used by her most gifted students. The notes described Mrs. Morrison's belief that she was helping children access temporal creative channels that allowed them to visualize and depict future events through their artwork. But Elena realized with growing horror that the teacher had been systematically drugging students with psychoactive substances in pursuit of unlocking precognitive abilities, turning innocent children into unwilling subjects in supernatural experiments. Elena's investigation into the fates of students whose names appeared on the prophetic artwork revealed a pattern of psychological destruction that had been carefully hidden from parents and the community, with most of the young artists suffering severe mental breakdowns during their teenage years, many requiring institutionalization, and a disproportionate number dying by suicide before reaching age 25, as if the burden of seeing future tragedies had shattered their developing minds. The school records showed that these students had been identified as exceptionally creative and placed in Mrs. Morrison's advanced classes based on standardized tests that Elena discovered had been designed to identify children with natural psychic sensitivity rather than artistic talent. When Elena attempted to research Mrs. Morrison's background and report her findings to school administrators, she encountered a wall of silence and deliberate obstruction that suggested the conspiracy extended far beyond one disturbed teacher and into the highest levels of the school district and local government. The final piece of evidence Elena uncovered was a recent drawing dated just 2 weeks before her arrival at Millbrook, showing her own face twisted in terror as she stood in the basement art storage room surrounded by the prophetic artwork, with her name written in a child's handwriting at the bottom, along with the words, "Miss Vasquez will try to tell the truth, but no one believes the art teacher who sees too much, and soon she'll make pictures too." Elena's attempts to contact parents of former students and expose the decades-long abuse were systematically thwarted when she learned that many of the families had been forced to sign non-disclosure agreements after their children's breakdowns, and several parents who had tried to investigate their children's mysterious illnesses had died in accidents or disappeared entirely, leaving Elena to realize she had uncovered not just evidence of child abuse, but a multi-generational conspiracy to harvest and exploit children's psychic abilities for purposes she couldn't fully comprehend. Story 4. David Kowalski had spent 18 years as a certified building inspector, examining everything from luxury hotels to abandoned warehouses across the Midwest, but his reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail had never prepared him for the horrors he would uncover in the basement of Fairview Elementary School in rural Iowa during what should have been a routine safety assessment for the building's planned demolition. The school district had hired David's inspection firm in November to evaluate the structural integrity of the 1950s building and identify any hazardous materials before contractors began tearing it down to make room for a new community center. And the initial walkthrough had revealed nothing more concerning than typical asbestos insulation and lead paint that characterized buildings from that era. David prided himself on his methodical approach to inspections, always checking areas that other inspectors might overlook, which led him to discover a series of rooms in the basement's eastern wing that didn't appear on any of the architectural plans provided by the school district or the original construction documents from 1954. The discrepancy bothered David enough that he spent an entire afternoon measuring and remeasuring the basement layout, comparing his findings to the blueprints until he was certain there was a hidden section approximately 30 feet long and 15 feet wide that had been deliberately concealed behind what appeared to be a standard utility room. When David brought his concerns to the district facilities manager, Robert Chen, the man seemed unusually agitated and insisted that the missing space was probably just a clerical error in the old blueprints, but he quickly authorized David to break through the wall to ensure there were no structural issues that could complicate the demolition process. The moment David's sledgehammer penetrated the concrete barrier, he was hit by a wave of chemical odors so intense that he had to retreat and return with a respirator mask, and what he discovered behind that wall would haunt him for the rest of his life and force him to question everything he thought he knew about the communities he served. The hidden rooms contained a fully equipped medical facility that looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1960s, complete with examination tables, surgical equipment, and walls lined with metal cabinets filled with preserved specimens, medical instruments, and thousands of files documenting illegal human experiments that had been conducted on students under the guise of routine health screenings and mandatory vaccinations. The preservation was so complete that David could read handwritten notes on clipboards hanging beside the examination tables, describing procedures that had been performed on children as young as 6 years old, including experimental surgeries, drug trials, and psychological conditioning programs that were designed to test the limits of human endurance and behavioral modification. David discovered that Fairview Elementary had served as a testing ground for government-sponsored medical research between 1958 and 1974, with school administrators collaborating with researchers from nearby universities and federal agencies to conduct experiments that violated every ethical standard of medical practice and human decency. The filing cabinets contained detailed medical records for over 300 students who had been selected as test subjects based on criteria that included family income, race, immigration status, and whether their parents were considered compliant by school authorities, creating a systematic program of abuse that targeted the most vulnerable children in the community. The experiments had included everything from testing experimental vaccines and psychiatric drugs to performing unnecessary surgeries and psychological conditioning designed to create behavioral changes that could be monitored over long periods, with some children subjected to multiple procedures over several years without their parents' knowledge or consent. What made David physically ill was finding preserved tissue samples and organs in laboratory-grade refrigeration units that were still operational after decades, along with photographs documenting the physical effects of various experimental treatments on children whose faces showed the unmistakable expressions of fear and confusion that came from being subjected to medical procedures they couldn't understand. The most disturbing files contained correspondence between Dr. Harrison Whitmore, who had served as the school's health coordinator, and researchers at prestigious medical institutions who were eager to obtain data from the Fairview experiments for their own research projects, treating the children's suffering as valuable scientific information rather than evidence of horrific abuse. David learned that the program had been designed to appear completely normal to parents and the community, with experimental procedures disguised as routine health checkups, vaccinations, and vision or hearing tests that were supposedly required by state law, ensuring that families never suspected their children were being used as human guinea pigs in medical experiments that had no therapeutic purpose. The cover-up had been so effective that when children suffered adverse reactions to experimental treatments, including permanent disabilities, psychological trauma, and even death, the incidents were attributed to natural illnesses, accidents, or genetic conditions, with school and medical authorities collaborating to prevent families from discovering the true cause of their children's suffering. David's investigation revealed that many of the children who had been subjected to experiments at Fairview Elementary grew up to suffer from chronic health problems, learning disabilities, and psychological disorders that had never been properly diagnosed or treated because acknowledging these conditions would have exposed the illegal experimentation program that had caused them. The most chilling discovery came when David found records indicating that the Fairview program had been part of a larger network of experimental sites operating in rural schools across the Midwest, with regular communication between Dr. Whitmore and coordinators at other locations who were conducting similar experiments on thousands of children throughout the region. When David attempted to report his findings to state authorities and federal agencies, he encountered a systematic campaign of intimidation and obstruction that included threats against his family, the revocation of his inspection licenses, and legal action designed to prevent him from discussing his discoveries with anyone, including law enforcement officials who claimed they had no jurisdiction over decades-old crimes. The final blow came when David learned that Dr. Whitmore had not died in 1974 as official records indicated, but had been relocated under a new identity and continued his experimental work at other institutions for decades, with government protection and funding that ensured his research would never be interrupted by concerns about ethics or legality, leaving David to realize that the horrors he had discovered at Fairview Elementary were not historical aberrations, but part of an ongoing system of abuse that continued to operate with official sanction and protection. Story 5. Jasmine Brooks had earned a reputation as one of the most fearless urban explorers on the West Coast, documenting abandoned buildings and forgotten spaces with a combination of historical research and daredevil photography that had attracted over 200,000 followers to her YouTube channel, dedicated to uncovering the hidden stories of America's decaying infrastructure. When she received a tip about Westfield High School in Northern California, a massive complex that had been abandoned since a budget crisis forced its closure in 2001, Jasmine was immediately intrigued by reports from local teenagers who claimed the building contained underground passages that connected to other structures throughout the small mountain town of Pine Ridge. The school itself was an imposing 3-story brick structure built in 1962 that had served nearly 1,500 students before its closure, and Jasmine's initial exploration revealed the typical signs of abandonment she had encountered in dozens of similar locations: broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, and the musty smell of decay that permeated every corner of the building. However, what set Westfield apart from other abandoned schools was the discovery of a maintenance door in the basement boiler room that opened onto a concrete staircase leading down into what appeared to be a sophisticated tunnel system that had been professionally constructed with reinforced concrete walls, electrical conduits, and ventilation systems that suggested far more planning and investment than would be necessary for simple utility access. Jasmine's exploration of the tunnel network began as an exciting adventure, but quickly transformed into a nightmare that challenged everything she thought she knew about the innocent suburban community of Pine Ridge and the true purpose of Westfield High School during its 40 years of operation. The main tunnel stretched for over half a mile underground, with multiple branches leading in different directions beneath the town, and Jasmine's flashlight revealed that the construction was far more sophisticated than anything she had encountered in previous explorations, with emergency lighting systems, communication cables, and reinforced blast doors that suggested the tunnels had been designed for purposes that went far beyond routine maintenance or emergency evacuation procedures. As Jasmine followed the primary tunnel eastward, she discovered that it connected to the basement of the town's community center, the public library, the police station, and, most disturbing of all, the residential neighborhoods where many of Westfield's students had lived, with tunnel entrances hidden in the basements of at least 12 houses that she was able to identify through careful mapping and surface reconnaissance. The implications of this discovery became increasingly horrifying, as Jasmine realized that the tunnel system would have allowed school personnel to access students' homes without detection, moving freely throughout the community, while bypassing all normal security measures and creating opportunities for abuse that parents and children would never have suspected or been able to prevent. Jasmine's investigation revealed that the tunnel construction had begun in the mid-1960s, under the supervision of Principal Edward Thornfield, and had been completed over several years using a combination of federal funding that was supposedly allocated for civil defense purposes and private donations from wealthy community members who claimed to be supporting educational infrastructure improvements. The tunnels contained multiple rooms that had been used for purposes that became clear when Jasmine discovered discarded furniture, medical equipment, and recording devices that suggested these underground spaces had served as locations where school personnel could bring students without anyone knowing they had left the building or where they had been taken. The most chilling evidence came when Jasmine found a room filled with personal belongings that had clearly belonged to children. Shoes, clothing, backpacks, and school supplies that bore the names and identification of students who had attended Westfield between 1965 and 2001. But many of these items showed signs of damage and distress that indicated their owners had not willingly parted with them. Jasmine's exploration of the tunnel system's eastern branch led her to a chamber beneath the town cemetery, where she discovered files and photographic evidence documenting a systematic program of child trafficking that had operated for decades with the full knowledge and participation of school administrators, local law enforcement, and prominent community members who had used the tunnel network to transport children to buyers throughout the region without leaving any trace of their activities above ground. The documentation revealed that Westfield High School had served as the central hub for an operation that identified vulnerable students, isolated them from their families through various pretexts, and ultimately sold them to networks of buyers who specialized in child exploitation, with the tunnels providing the perfect infrastructure for moving victims without detection by parents, social services, or outside law enforcement agencies. Jasmine learned that the operation had been so successful that it had expanded beyond Pine Ridge to include partnerships with similar programs at schools in neighboring communities, creating a regional network of child trafficking that had destroyed hundreds of lives while enriching the very people who were supposed to protect and educate the community's children. The evidence suggested that many students who were officially listed as runaways or transfer students had actually been victims of the trafficking operation, with school records falsified to cover their disappearances and prevent investigations that might have exposed the conspiracy. When Jasmine attempted to document her findings and report them to authorities, she discovered that several of the people implicated in the trafficking operation were still alive and holding positions of power within the community, including former teachers who had become city council members, police officers who had been promoted to leadership positions, and business owners who had used their wealth and influence to ensure that the truth about Westfield High School would never be revealed. Jasmine's efforts to expose the conspiracy were met with threats, legal intimidation, and ultimately physical violence when she was attacked in the tunnels by individuals who knew about her investigation and were determined to prevent her from sharing what she had learned, forcing her to flee Pine Ridge and abandon her documentation in order to save her own life, but not before she had hidden copies of the most damning evidence in locations where they might eventually be found by investigators who had the power and courage to pursue justice for the victims of one of America's most horrific and long-running crimes against children. Story 6. Robert Hayes had worked as a maintenance supervisor for the Cleveland Public School District for 23 years, taking pride in keeping the city's aging educational facilities functional and safe for the thousands of students who pass through their doors each day. But his discovery at Theodore Roosevelt Middle School would shatter his faith in the institutions he had devoted his career to supporting and force him to confront evidence of crimes so disturbing that he would spend the rest of his life questioning whether he had done enough to protect the children who had been victimized under his watch. The assignment seemed routine when Robert was asked to prepare Roosevelt Middle School for demolition in preparation for a new construction project, requiring him to clear out decades of accumulated materials and equipment from the building that had served the community since 1948 before being closed due to declining enrollment and budget constraints in 2019. Robert's methodical approach to clearing the building led him to explore every corner of the massive structure, including areas that hadn't been accessed in years, which brought him to a locked storage room in the sub-basement that was hidden behind the school's boiler room and had apparently been forgotten by previous maintenance crews who had worked in the building. The room was secured with multiple heavy-duty padlocks and a steel bar across the door, suggesting that someone had been extremely concerned about preventing unauthorized access to whatever was stored inside. And when Robert finally managed to cut through the security measures, He was immediately struck by the overpowering smell of chemical preservatives that indicated the room had been used for purposes far removed from normal school storage needs. Inside the chamber, Robert discovered what appeared to be a professional photography darkroom from the 1970s, complete with enlargers, chemical baths, and drying equipment that had been meticulously maintained despite the building's abandonment. But what made his blood run cold was realizing that the hundreds of developed photographs hanging from lines throughout the room showed students in various stages of undress and distress, clearly taken without their knowledge or consent by someone with unlimited access to the school's facilities. The darkroom contained thousands of photographs that documented systematic abuse spanning multiple decades, with images showing children who had attended Roosevelt Middle School being photographed in compromising positions, often appearing drugged or coerced, in locations throughout the building, including classrooms, bathrooms, the gymnasium, and the principal's office, creating a comprehensive record of predatory behavior that had been hidden in plain sight while parents trusted the school to protect their children. Robert's investigation of the darkroom revealed that the photography operation had been far more sophisticated than a single perpetrator could have managed, with evidence of multiple cameras, different photographic techniques, and organizational systems that suggested a network of individuals working together to document and distribute images of child abuse for commercial purposes. The photographs were organized by year, grade level, and individual students, with some children appearing in dozens of images taken over multiple years, indicating that the abuse had been systematic and long-term rather than opportunistic incidents, and many of the photos bore handwritten notes describing specific requests from buyers who were purchasing the images for their personal collections. Robert discovered filing cabinets containing correspondence between school personnel and external buyers who were paying substantial amounts of money for custom photographs of specific students, with orders that included detailed descriptions of poses, clothing, and scenarios that buyers wanted to see, turning the children's victimization into a profitable business enterprise that had operated for decades without detection by parents or law enforcement. The most disturbing aspect of Robert's discovery was finding evidence that the photography operation had been protected and facilitated by administrators at the highest levels of the school district, including principals, vice principals, and district officials who had provided access to students, covered up complaints from parents, and actively recruited vulnerable children for participation in what they disguised as routine school activities like yearbook photography, sports team pictures, and academic achievement ceremonies. The darkroom contained detailed records showing that the operation had generated millions of dollars in revenue over the years, with profits being shared among school personnel who participated in the abuse and used their positions of trust and authority to identify and groom victims, while ensuring that parents and other adults never suspected what was happening to their children during regular school hours. Robert learned that many of the students who appeared in the photographs had been selected based on specific criteria that made them ideal victims, including children from single-parent households, families with financial difficulties, students with learning disabilities or behavioral problems, and those whose parents worked multiple jobs and had limited time to monitor their children's school experiences closely. The photography operation had been so well organized that it included backup systems for storing and distributing images, with multiple copies of every photograph being kept in different locations and regular shipments of new material being sent to buyers throughout the country who were part of a network of individuals who specialized in purchasing and trading images of child abuse. When Robert attempted to report his findings to school district officials and law enforcement agencies, he encountered a wall of silence and obstruction that suggested the conspiracy extended far beyond Roosevelt Middle School and included individuals in positions of power who were determined to prevent the truth from being revealed and the victims from receiving justice for the crimes that had been committed against them. Robert's efforts to expose the photography operation were met with threats against his family, attempts to discredit his reputation, and ultimately termination from his position with the school district on fabricated charges of misconduct that were designed to prevent him from having any credibility if he continued to pursue the matter through official channels. The final revelation came when Robert learned that similar darkrooms and photography operations had existed at multiple schools throughout the district, creating a network of child abuse that had victimized thousands of students over several decades while generating enormous profits for the perpetrators who used their positions in the educational system to exploit the trust that families placed in teachers and administrators who were supposed to protect and nurture their children. Robert realized that his discovery at Roosevelt Middle School was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic program of child exploitation that had been protected by corruption at every level of the educational and legal systems, leaving him to struggle with the knowledge that many of the victims whose photographs he had found were now adults who had never learned the truth about what had been done to them during their school years, and might never receive the justice and healing they deserved for crimes that had been carefully hidden and deliberately covered up by the very institutions that should have been their protectors. Story 7. Amanda Foster had built her career as an environmental cleanup specialist by tackling the most challenging hazardous material situations across the Southwest, from abandoned chemical plants to contaminated military installations, but her contract at Sunset Valley High School in Arizona would expose her to horrors that had nothing to do with industrial pollution and everything to do with the darkest capabilities of human nature disguised as educational excellence. The school district had hired Amanda's company in August to assess and remediate potential environmental hazards before converting the abandoned campus into a community college, and the initial surveys had identified typical concerns for a building constructed in the 1960s, including asbestos in ceiling tiles and lead paint on interior surfaces that would require careful removal before renovation could begin. Amanda's reputation for thoroughness led her to conduct more extensive testing than most contractors would consider necessary, including air quality measurements and soil samples from areas around the building that might have been contaminated by decades of chemical storage or improper disposal practices by maintenance staff who weren't trained in environmental safety protocols. Her investigation took an ominous turn when she discovered that the chemistry department's basement storage areas contained chemical readings that were far more dangerous and complex than anything that should have existed in a high school laboratory, with residual compounds that suggested the presence of substances that were restricted to military and research applications rather than educational demonstrations. The basement chemistry lab was a sprawling complex of interconnected rooms that had been designed with industrial-grade ventilation systems, reinforced storage cabinets, and safety equipment that far exceeded what any high school would need for standard science education. And Amanda's initial assessment revealed that someone had been conducting chemical experiments that required hazardous materials licenses and specialized training that high school teachers wouldn't possess. Amanda's exploration of the hidden laboratory areas revealed evidence of a sophisticated chemical manufacturing operation that had been disguised as an advanced chemistry program, with equipment capable of producing everything from industrial solvents and pharmaceutical compounds to more sinister substances that could be used for behavioral modification, poisoning, or creating untraceable methods of harming human beings without leaving obvious evidence of foul play. The discovery that horrified Amanda most was finding detailed laboratory notebooks that documented decades of chemical experiments conducted not on laboratory animals or synthetic materials, but on human subjects who were identified only by numbers and coded references that corresponded to student identification systems used by the school district between 1968 and 2003. The notebooks revealed that Mr. Gerald Hawthorne, who had served as the chemistry department head for 35 years, had been using his position and access to students to conduct illegal human experimentation that involved administering various chemical compounds to children without their knowledge or consent, often by contaminating food served in the school cafeteria, or adding substances to drinking water in specific areas of the building where targeted students spent time. Amanda learned that Hawthorne's experiments had been designed to test the effects of different chemical compounds on human behavior, cognitive function, and physical health, with detailed observations recorded about how various substances affected students' academic performance, social interactions, and psychological stability over periods ranging from days to years, depending on the specific compounds being tested. The laboratory notebooks contained hundreds of entries describing experiments that had been conducted on students who were selected based on criteria that included family background, academic ability, and whether their parents were likely to notice changes in their children's behavior or question unusual symptoms that might develop as a result of chemical exposure. Amanda discovered that many of the compounds Hawthorne had been testing were experimental drugs that had been rejected by pharmaceutical companies due to dangerous side effects, industrial chemicals that were known to cause neurological damage, and synthetic substances that had been developed by military researchers for use in psychological warfare but were considered too dangerous for field deployment. The most disturbing entries in the laboratory notebooks described Hawthorne's collaboration with researchers at universities and government agencies who were interested in obtaining data from his human experiments, with regular correspondence discussing the results of various chemical tests and requests for specific types of experiments to be conducted on students who met particular demographic or physical criteria. Amanda realized that Sunset Valley High School had served as an unauthorized human testing facility for decades, with students being used as unwitting subjects in chemical experiments that violated every ethical standard of scientific research and medical practice, while their parents trusted the school to provide a safe and nurturing educational environment. The laboratory contained preserved tissue samples and biological specimens that had been collected from students who had been exposed to various experimental compounds, along with detailed medical records documenting the physical and psychological effects of chemical exposure on developing adolescents, creating a comprehensive database of human suffering that had been disguised as legitimate scientific research. Amanda's investigation revealed that many students who had attended Sunset Valley during Hawthorne's tenure had developed unexplained health problems, learning disabilities, and psychological disorders that had never been properly diagnosed or treated because acknowledging these conditions would have exposed the illegal experimentation program that had caused them. The cover-up had been so effective that when students suffered adverse reactions to experimental chemical exposure, including permanent disabilities, organ damage, and even death, the incidents were attributed to natural illnesses, genetic conditions, or accidents that prevented families from discovering the true cause of their children's suffering and seeking appropriate medical treatment or legal recourse. When Amanda attempted to report her findings to state and federal environmental agencies, she encountered systematic obstruction and intimidation that included threats against her professional licenses, legal action designed to prevent her from discussing her discoveries, and ultimately physical attacks on her laboratory equipment and personal property that made it clear that powerful individuals were determined to prevent the truth about Sunset Valley High School from being revealed. Amanda learned that Hawthorne had not retired in 2003 as official records indicated, but had been relocated to other educational institutions where he continued his experimental work under different identities, with government protection and funding that ensured his research would never be interrupted by concerns about ethics, legality, or the welfare of the children who were being used as human test subjects in his ongoing chemical experiments. The final horrifying revelation came when Amanda discovered that the Sunset Valley program had been part of a national network of schools where similar chemical experimentation was being conducted on students, with regular communication between Hawthorne and other researchers who were using children as test subjects in pursuit of developing chemical compounds that could be used for military, intelligence, and social control purposes, leaving Amanda to realize that her discovery represented not just decades of abuse at one school, but evidence of a systematic program of human experimentation that had victimized thousands of children across the country while being protected and funded by the very government agencies that were supposed to ensure the safety and welfare of American students.